Boulder 2 weeks ago, and 3 of us came with our own computers, one from the United Nations, one from California, and one from Nigeria. We just plugged them in and they worked. I'm trying to get the technical people at the UN to get that system. Did it catch up yet? No. Okay. It'll load. While it's loading, perhaps we can start the questions. We have about 15 or 20 minutes before the break. So I'd like to open the floor up to questions and comments. Just raise your hand if anybody has any. Yes, please.
Is this working? Okay, great. We talked about sustainability and throughout today.
Sorry, can you just introduce yourself,
Oh, sorry.
please?
Susan Davis with Water for People. And we talked about sustainable water programs and emergencies and emergency preparedness. I wonder how you can balance them. Is there a way to build in preparedness in a water system or water and sanitation? Are there any successful examples of that?
Anybody? Go ahead. Ron, go ahead.
I can just give anecdotal evidence about Port-au-Prince, where I'm hearing that the city water capacity is actually now 50% over what it was pre-earthquake. It was actually luckily not as damaged as it could have been, and that they've been able with emergency resources to actually improve the system since the earthquake. I still haven't heard from anybody who's doing point of use testing and how well that's going, but at least the water itself is there.
Paul?
Yeah. Obviously, it depends upon what the emergency is about. And if it's something like Haiti, where your infrastructure is weak anyway, the infrastructure which was there, even though there's some bits of it, believe it or not, in Port-au-Prince is still working. So it's not all completely wrecked. But when you've got that sort of crisis, it's very, very difficult to build in anything that will protect it. With floods, it is possible. I mean, you can build, particularly if you look at what the average floods are over an area, you can build in things with wells that will protect wells, particularly with hand pumps. You can build in, some sort of protection measures. Putting in, even where you have heavy floods, you can put in areas where if people are going to move, you know where they're going to move to beforehand if you've already pre-planned that, and you can put in systems that will protect it. Obviously, in cities, it's a bit different, and it depends upon the sort of infrastructure you've got in the city. Infrastructure in some cities, particularly in Chile, the infrastructure was better, so that the damage in Chile, for example, after the earthquake, was considerably less than what it was in Haiti, because in Haiti they didn't have it. There's no building standards, there's no standards of regular. Much of the systems weren't working. Parts of Port-au-Prince was never planned anyway, and therefore there was no water system in Port-au-Prince, in parts of Port-au-Prince, to destroy, because it wasn't really there. There wasn't any system there to destroy. So it would depend really upon where it is. To how you can protect it. But it is possible if you pre-plan and you know what the constraints are.
Thank you. Yes, please.
You speak to the issue of readiness for change because many times there is a great capacity to care and give and reach out, but there isn't readiness on the local site to advantage that. Can you give some specific examples where there hadn't been readiness and then readiness came along, and what changed, whether by culture or a different type of leadership, that made an area ready to make a quantum leap in development?
I guess, and I'm probably not the right person to talk to it, your colleague right next door to you is, but I guess in Bangladesh, when we've looked at what happened over the last, say, 20 to 30 years, when the series of cyclones and hurricanes and what have you, and the number of people that were killed, say, 20 years ago, to the number of people that were killed 18 months ago, and what has happened in between, the amount of activities have gone on, the way that the communities have taken on board, lots of new activities and lots of new preparedness ways. that the numbers of people that were killed in the last major crisis in Bangladesh was considerably less proportionally than what had been, over the previous ones. As I say, our friend next door to you is the best person to talk to that from BRAC. But I mean, to me, that's always an example. I can remember people saying that this was because so many of the issues that have been talked about over the years had been taken on by communities, community groups like BRAC and others that have worked specifically with the community to build in some preparedness. I mean, there are other areas, I guess, that I could think about as well. But I mean, that's one that strikes me as immediately that the numbers of people who were killed last time compared with what they were 6 or 8 years ago was dramatic.
Yeah, I would just add to that. We go into a group of communities and we'll work with those for 15 years, a development program. And many times when we first go into the communities and we ask about the priorities of the communities, then water is very high on that list of priorities. So in a way, there doesn't have to be a change for the communities to see the great need in water. But I think it's really the understanding of water quality and sanitation and hygiene, which comes from very good behavior change communication, that brings about that change. And the other thing is just the ownership of the systems. That from the very beginning, we work in capacity building to make sure that the communities are going to have ownership of those systems. Because if they consider it to be belonging to an organization, then when it breaks down, then it's the organization system. So I think those are really the micro elements of change that have to occur.
Are there any other comment? Yes, please. Second row.
One comment that I'd like to, or one question I'd like to pose was also that, for instance, I've worked in more developed countries where there's a lot of liquidities, places like the GCC, and I was recently in Bangladesh where I was pleasantly surprised that the analysis, for instance, we were working on a project where we were using cellulosic ethanol out of municipal solid waste, where their analysis was spectacular. Right? They had done a lot of work and research as to the logistics and sort of how much of it was organic, inorganic, and whatnot. Much of that is what drives this. And we were working on an independent water and power producing project. Places that have the liquidity where capital is not an issue very often don't have it. But I would imagine that this is a big problem, having the research and the data, and this is where it really becomes an issue. As a commercial scale project where we're attracting investors, they don't want to subsidize R&D, right? They want to finance a project, and where organizations that come in and really help with the costs of this research and making this data available to firms that want to come into areas like Bangladesh or the lesser developed areas like Haiti and whatnot, and having that research available is really what's going to enable the private. And I realize you have an issue, but we can discuss that. But clearly, I would add one other comment. In this country, right, we've seen toll roads and various facilities, and there is an increasing wave of privatization. And you're right, some of it has been a failure, but I would tell you that tends to be where it's pseudo-privatization, right, where we're not quite, right, completely, we don't have the liberty of utilizing market factors, right, and so they tend to fall by the wayside. But I would tell you there is an increasing wave of privatization, and not on all levels, but clearly some of it cannot be a factor, but independent water and power producers have been a success overall globally, right? Not just here in the U.S., well, less here in the U.S., but really more in the developing countries. But are people willing to fund the research and the data that's necessary to execute these transactions?